The Many Forms of Teacher by Rowena Parks of Bellingen 2454. Narrated by Janine Penfold. First day of school, I ran headlong into the crowd of children in the playground. Here, in this little country school with its wooden verandas, towering school bell, and sprawling playground, I felt happy. I was finally at this place of learning, adventure, and to my young eyes, beautiful teachers. Little did I know then that classrooms and playgrounds would be where I'd spend most of my adult life. Educere is the Latin root for education. It means to draw out or to call forth what is already present as a possibility. I find myself asking the question, where did my calling to be a teacher come from? My father left school at 14, but inspired me to see how teaching comes in many forms and is about relationships. He taught me work is first and foremost a calling. Like his father and grandfather before him, my father was an oyster farmer on the Clyde River in a small coastal town in New South Wales where I grew up. My father connected with the story of the river, known by the Walbungia people of the Yuin Nation as Bundu, depending on it for livelihood, identity, and deep sense of place. At age 5, I remember my father seated cross-legged on our oyster shed's wooden floor, tapping the edge of a hard oyster shell with the blade of an oyster knife. I sat next to him, watching intently. The smell of briny Hessian bags, river mud, and the sharp lemon scent of winter wattle filled the air. Tap, tap, the knife plunged under the shell as he prized it open, scraped the pearly flesh of the oyster, plopped it in a bottle and rinsed the shell. Every now and again he rendered Dorothy McKellar's "I Love a Sunburnt Country" with gusto, stopping occasionally to admire the Clyde River that lapped at our boat shed like a thirsty dog. Then he scooped up an oyster, tilted his throat back and swallowed it whole. For a moment, my father paused and lifted his faded, river-blue eyes up to meet mine. "You know, Rowie," he said, "there's not a day goes by that I don't love my work." At age 50, my father became terminally ill with leukemia. While he was receiving his treatments at Canberra Hospital, doctors noticed my father's concern for other patients and his ability to show gratitude despite painful bone marrow treatment. In no time, they asked him to help other terminally ill patients. With his skinny legs in slippers, woolen dressing gown pulled around his stick-thin frame, my father sat beside them and yarned. He told patients he was fighting this bloody cancer. He taught them how to laugh in its face. He told them stories about the year the sun scorched so hot that he lost all his bloody oysters, of heading up the river in his launch to his oyster leases in the inkiness of the early hours. How the river would slowly reveal its morning face mist-lit, heralding the start of a brand new day. Soon the sick and dying shared their stories and found themselves laughing with him. When their tears came, my father held their hand and sat quietly, as though he was listening to the murmur of the river. The hospital staff told my family that my father became a teacher to all who worked there, as well as to many cancer patients. My English mother came from a refined, upper-class family with a penchant for a good cup of English breakfast tea in a fine bone china teacup and saucer. As a little girl, I looked forward to coming home from school. My mother was there in the kitchen as I munched on my afternoon tea and rattled off details of my day. I watched her hands move deftly, stoking up the wood stove. She had once wished her hands were those of a veterinary surgeon, but was unable to complete her education due to the war. She was in London during the Blitz, and at 17 worked in the Women's Land Army. Despite having little to no agricultural experience, my mother ploughed, grew produce, milked cows, caught rats, drove tractors, and much more. Such a happy time of my life, my mother recounts. I always liked hearing the rest of her story. Eventually, I wanted to see more of the world, so I came to Sydney in 1949. I answered an ad for a nurse's posting in this tiny country town of Batemans Bay, Australia. Recently, sifting through remnants of my mother's life, I found she had kept the first little school suitcase I had in kindergarten. Inside, my mother had filled it with symbols of my young life: athletic ribbons, a first prize certificate awarded to me, age 6, for best patty cakes at our local show. Among music and school reports, there were also letters I wrote over the years. One can never underestimate the power of a mother's love. I realised that it was for my mother I ran my races at school, stopping to find her in the crowd before I headed to the finish line. It was for my mother that I got up on stage, dressed in beautiful costumes she had painstakingly created, and sang or acted. Education, Rowie, education. Make something of yourself, she always said. To my mother, I paraded my school reports, my university entrance, and finally the Bachelor of Education degree certificate. "We have made it!" she exclaimed, and danced me around the kitchen. I think back to when I was 5, and my father's words as he shucked oysters by the river. Like him, I can say to my children and grandchildren that there was not a day where I didn't love teaching. I have both my parents to thank for building foundations of a love for inspiring others to learn, making me who I am today. The end.